So I was searching the internet the other day, and I was on Reddit, I think, and I saw this. Somebody had created a random scale generator, and it got me thinking about practicing scales. So I wanted to make this video where I talk about practicing scales. So there's a lot to say about that. It's a huge topic. What I want to focus on is the mistakes I think I made and a lot of people make when they're practicing scales, how you can make it more effective. And I want to divide it into two different things. Practicing scales from a mental perspective, knowing what the scales are so that you can hear them and play them and know what the notes are and where they are on the fretboard, and also then the technical aspect of actually being able to play scales fast with good technique and play them effortlessly so that you can make music, improvise or play music in general with the scales. So a lot of people, they take pride in not practicing scales, or they avoid scales. They think, well, it's just too mechanical and not musical. But I think most of us realize that practicing scales is good to some degree, and most of us have practiced scales at some point. So for me, the mistake I made was that I learned how to read a little bit at first. I could read music early on because I was playing another instrument before I played the guitar, but then I learned all the scales, all the modes of the major scale as shapes, patterns, fingering boxes. And I had no idea what the notes were. I just learned them. And then I just, you just move them around. So a major scale. You don't have to know what the notes are. We're all aware of this problem that the guitar presents, whereas a trumpet player, for example, need to know what the notes are of all the keys to be able to play. So those boxes and those shapes can be useful, and we should be aware of them, but we also need to step outside of that system to really learn what we're doing. So the reason that scale generator got me thinking is because it's overwhelming. If you're going to practice the modes of the major scale, let's say we're going to work on the modes of the major scale. So there's 7 major modes, and then all the different keys and all the different fingerings. That's too much work. It's too overwhelming. We want to be more effective. So I suggest you do this. You work on a scale or 2 a day, and you randomly pick different keys. And then gradually you're gonna get to know all the different scales more and more. So let's say we work on the modes of the major scales. So I could use that generator. If you don't want to use the generator, you could just take pieces of paper and write down all the scales you want to work on, and put those little papers in a jar, and then another jar with all the keys, and then you just randomly pick 2 a day. So let's say your first pick is D Dorian, let's say. I like to use some kind of drone or something, so I'll use a Tanpura app drone, set it to D. Before I even play the scale, we're gonna play it on one string only, on the D string. I want to make sure that I can sing it, so you don't have to be able to sing well, you just have to be able to hit the notes. So do 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 ba da. That's a Dorian scale, I hope. Then you want to be able to sing it with note names. D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. And the scale degrees. 1, 2, flat 3. Sometimes I'll check that I'm in some kind of pitch. 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 1, flat 7, 6, 5, 4, flat 3, 2, 1. I also teach ear training, and I always tell my students, don't worry if your singing voice is not good. As you can tell, my singing voice is not very good. That's not the point. The point is that you need to be able to hit the notes. If you find that what I just did very difficult, the idea here is, this might sound harsh, but If you can't do that, what I just did there, you're not really ready to play the scales. You know what I mean? Because you need to be able to, people say hear all the time, like hear the scale in your head. It's not the right word really, it's because we're not hearing it. We're imagining, we're creating the sound in our mind, in our head, and then we project that to our instrument. That's how the process should work, because if I'm just practicing finger shapes and I learn the Dorian that way, doesn't matter how much I practice, I'm just letting the fingers do the work. In order to create music, you know, your fingers are not gonna come up with music. Your mind is gonna come up with music. Hopefully that's how it should work. The mind or your imagination should decide what you're playing, not the fingers. So if you find that it's very difficult to do that, to sing the scales like that, you know, maybe start with just a few scales, maybe just the major and minor, and then introduce the modes later on. There are also tricks, right, to learn how to do that. You can think of the first 4 notes as a minor scale, and then go up and sing a minor scale from here. So it's a minor 4-note scale and a minor, not a minor 4-note scale. You can also think of how all the notes relate to the roots. That's why I was using a drone like that. You might want to use a chord as a drone, like if you can freeze a chord if you have a freeze pedal. But ideally you don't really want to do that, I think. But you need to be able to make sure that you're actually doing it right without that. It's a little bit too much help. So I'm not thinking at all about how I'm playing this technically. Could be just one finger. Then what you want to do is you want to imagine, visualize. So practicing away from your instrument. I'm imagining doing what I just did. And then play. Right? And then when you can do that and you feel comfortable doing that, that's when you start playing it as a scale more vertically. So maybe 3 notes per string, starting there. Same thing, visualize and imagine you're doing that. Maybe just doing like what I'm doing now, or even away from his instrument, just thinking that you're playing. Then you play it. And there are different ways you can get away from that box. So you could play maybe 4 notes per string, so 1 note slide. So I have talked about that. I have a previous video where I talk about that kind of stuff that you find in the Mikko book called The Advancing Guitarist. So if you want to check out that, I'm going to reference, I think, a lot of my previous videos in this video, because I have talked about this stuff before. Okay, so then I move on, maybe 2 modes per day. So the next mode I pick happened to be E Lydian, let's say. So this app is called Tanpura Droid. Again, you want to be able to sing it before you even play it. Just gonna play it on 1 string. So numbers 1, 2, 3, sharp 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then note names: E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B, C sharp, D sharp, E. So a couple of things need to come together here. Theory, you need to know what the notes are, the names of the notes, and ear training, being able to hear them, imagine them, and know what they are, where they are on your instrument, and play them with good technique and a good sound, and all that needs to come together. And then visualize playing it 3 notes per string, starting maybe down here. So you can go in and out, maybe play some notes just to make sure that you're not wandering. Okay, so that was the first part. That's the mental practicing. Now we get into the technical aspect of practicing. But I think what happens to some people is that they put too much focus on the technical aspect and forget that you actually need to know what the notes are. And then there's this risk that you're just gonna move your fingers randomly and you're not really making music, right? So there's a little bit different depending on if you're a jazz musician or a classical musician. Because the goal for the jazz musician is to be able to improvise. So we're not gonna be able to play everything with perfect technique and the best fingering possible and the best technique possible, because we might have to abandon an idea in the middle of a phrase and play something else. So it's not possible to play everything we play with perfect technique if we're improvising. Whereas if you're a classical player, you're preparing exactly how you're gonna play a piece. You can sit down and write out the exact best fingering you can think of and play it like that. But so we're not practicing like that if you're a jazz musician. I'm not saying one approach is better than the other. I'm just saying it's a little bit of different scenarios that we're preparing for. But when we're practicing technique, I always like to look at the classical world. So we're going to take Andres Segovia's scales, which is something you can find pretty easily online. So this is how classical guitarists practice. But we're not going to look at this hand. Obviously, if we're a jazz player, we're using a pick. So the first scale he shows you there is a C major. So this is a very specific fingering he wants you to use with a position shift. After 1 octave, and then another octave. And the same thing on the way down. So here I'm shifting. There are 3 ways you can change, right? You can do a position shift like here, or you can slide, or you can stretch. But here we're doing position shift. This is something that I find lacking in jazz guitar books, the idea of position shift. So I remember I learned those boxes I talked about earlier, right? And I would practice those, had no idea what notes I was playing. And then I would see someone like Pat Metheny play, and you notice that he doesn't seem to be very concerned with playing in a box. So there's something else going on there. More horizontal playing. I have also made a video in the past called Horizontal versus Vertical Playing that you can check out if you're interested in that stuff. But the idea of executing a position shift is interesting. So the position shift happens there. What you can do is you can really focus in on that shift. So I'm actually looking at the fret that I'm going to. You really focus on that fret, that note, and then you're thinking about the finger that is going to play that note, which is the index finger. So you're looking there and you're thinking, your awareness is on the index finger. And here, it's the 3rd finger that is going to go there. So I'm focusing on where I'm going and I'm aware of that finger. Where actually I'm looking at the 4th fret and I'm focusing on that finger, but I'm not looking at it. So I guess most classical musicians would practice with a metronome So that's a good idea to do. So we're not talking about building speed or anything like that here. You know, if you want to play like a shredder, like a heavy metal shredder, like to play scales really fast. That's another topic which I have also talked about. Because it all depends, right? Or do you want to play like Tom Quayle? You know, that's one kind of technique. Or you're gonna play like John McLaughlin. It's a completely different story. So if you want to practice that stuff, you have to think about how you're picking or using legato and that kind of stuff. So I have also made videos about that as well that you can check out. But here we're thinking about executing with proper technique, clean and good tone and even. Let's take a little bit more difficult scale. Let's take another scale from the Segovia book, G major. That's 4 octaves. So the first position shift happens at the same place, but this is G major. Here, and now here, and here. So now I'm looking at the 8th fret, but I'm thinking about the index finger. Now I'm looking at the 12th fret, thinking about the index finger. Is this the best fingering possible? I don't know. It's not relevant. It doesn't really matter. We're just, if Andre Segovia think it's a good fingering, I'm guessing it's okay. There are many ways you can practice this to improve your technique. You could play speed bursts like this. Ultimately, you want to be able to not look at the instrument, right? Even when you're doing those position shifts. You could do like a dotted 8th note and a 16th note to create a different... that rhythm kind of helps you to build speed. Or the opposite. So when you do that, you should definitely practice with the metronome. But remember, we're jazz players, so I like to use a swing beat to create a swing feel, because we're not gonna play like that. We're gonna play jazz, right? So I'll use another app called Drum Genius and use a swing from there. So here's a swing beat, and then just practice the scale to that. All of a sudden, it's not that easy. Plus, we don't usually start on beat 1 when we play jazz, so I try to find a way to play the scale without starting on the first beat, so maybe... maybe like that. So I'm using legato and playing the way I am playing when I'm playing jazz. I'm not picking every note, I'm using a combination of legato and picking. Some people might say it's a sacrilege to play Andre Segovia scales like that, but I don't really care. Let's just look at another scale. So there are tons of scales in that book with the fingerings written out. So I think it's a really good thing to go over that stuff, even if you're not a classical player. It really helps for the position shift. So a melodic minor, when classical musicians play that scale, they play it differently on the way down, but I'm gonna play it different, the same ascending as well as descending. So there's a slide there, position shift, slide, position shift. So again, here I'm thinking about the F sharp, and I'm looking at the F sharp, and my index finger is gonna jump there. So you could do this. You could play 2 notes on the where you do the shifts. That's another technique you can use to improve your position shift. Ultimately, you want to be able to do it in time. With the swing, let's see if I can do this. And then not starting on beat 1. Again, like how you're using slides and legato, or how if you're picking every note, it's so different. There is no, that's the beauty of jazz, I think. There is no set of rules, but you're allowed to break the rules and come up with your own way of doing things. So, but it's good to think about that kind of stuff. So it's gonna also shape what kind of player you become, depending on if you do a lot of legato, and also gonna depending on what kind of instrument you're playing. You know, if you have low action, all that kind of stuff. So hopefully that will give you some ideas on how to practice scales, so you can apply that to any scale you're practicing, if you're practicing the modes of the melodic minor or what have you. So being able to imagine the scale and sing it in your mind, at least, with note names and scale degrees before you try to learn the positions, and then visualize yourself practicing the scales without even touching the instrument or touching the instruments. You could do both. And then if you practice like that, that will save you time, so that you're not just moving your fingers, and because that it's all just muscle memory, and you need muscle memory too. So it's not that I'm saying that you shouldn't practice scales like that too. So that's the mental aspect of practicing scales. And then there's a technical side of it where you're actually practicing the scales in some kind of coherent pattern, and then trying to improve your technique and all that. So videos that I have mentioned in this video, I talked about a video where I talk about picking technique and stuff like that. I think I have 2 videos on that topic. Then I was talking about a video I made where I talk about vertical versus horizontal playing. I also talked about a video I made where I covered the book called The Advancing Guitarist by Mikko, where he talks about how to break away from the patterns or the shapes or the boxes, whatever you want to call it. So that was a lot of stuff. Thanks for watching. Thank you for your time and your attention, and I shall see you next time.